The history of New Zealand dates back at least 700 years to when it was discovered and settled by Polynesians, who developed a distinct Maori culture centered on kinship links and land. The first European explorer to sight New Zealand was Abel Janszoon Tasman on 13 December 1642. Captain James Cook, who reached New Zealand in October 1769 on the first of his 3 voyages, was the first European explorer to circumnavigate and map New Zealand. For the late 18th century, the country was regularly visited by explorers and other sailors, missionaries, traders and adventurers. In 1840 the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the British Crown and various Maori chiefs, bringing New Zealand into the British Empire and giving Maori equal rights with British citizens. There was extensive British settlement throughout the rest of the century. War and the imposition of a European economic and legal system led to most of New Zealand's land passing from Maori to Pākehā ownership, and most Maori subsequently became impoverished. For the 1890s the New Zealand Parliament enacted a number of progressive initiatives, including women's suffrage and old age pensions. The country remained an enthusiastic member of the British Empire, and 110,000 men fought in World War I. After the war, New Zealand signed the Treaty of Versailles, joined the League of Nations, and pursued an independent foreign policy, while its defense was still controlled by Britain. When World War II broke out in 1939, New Zealanders contributed to the defense of the British Empire. The country contributed some 120,000 troops. For the 1930s the economy was highly regulated and an extensive welfare state was developed. Meanwhile, Maori culture underwent a renaissance, and from the 1950s Maori began moving to the cities in large numbers. This led to the development of a Maori protest movement, which in turn led to greater recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi in the late 20th century. The country's economy suffered in the aftermath of the 1973 global energy crisis, the loss of New Zealand's biggest export market upon Britain's entry to the European Economic Community, and rampant inflation. In the 1980s the economy was largely deregulated and a number of socially liberal policies, such as decriminalization of homosexuality, were put in place. Foreign policy involved support for Britain in the World Wars, and close relations after 1940 with the United States and Australia. Foreign policy after 1980 became more independent, especially in pushing for a nuclear-free region. Subsequent governments have generally maintained these policies, although tempering the free market ethos somewhat. In 1984, the fourth Labour government was elected amid a constitutional and economic crisis. The economic reforms were led by Finance Minister Roger Douglas, who enacted fundamental, radically neoliberal and unexpectedly pro-free market reforms known as Rogernomics. Polynesian Foundation. New Zealand was originally settled by Polynesians from eastern Polynesia. The most current reliable evidence strongly indicates that initial settlement of New Zealand occurred around 1280 CE. Previous dating of some Kiori bones at 50150 CE has now been shown to have been unreliable. New samples of bone match the 1280 CE date of the earliest archaeological sites and the beginning of sustained anthropogenic deforestation. The descendants of these settlers became known as the Maori, forming a distinct culture of their own. The separate settlement of the tiny Chatham Islands in the east of New Zealand about 1500 CE produced the Moriori people. Linguistic evidence indicates that the Moriori were mainland Maori who ventured eastward. The original settlers quickly exploited the abundant large game in New Zealand, such as moa, which were large flightless ratites pushed to extinction by about 1500. As moa and other large game became scarce or extinct, Maori culture underwent major change, with regional differences. In areas where it was possible to grow taro and kumara, horticulture became more important. This was not possible in the south of the South Island, but wild plants such as fernroot were often available and cabbage trees were harvested and cultivated for food. Warfare also increased in importance, reflecting increased competition for land and other resources. In this period, fortified power became more common, although there is debate about the actual frequency of warfare. As elsewhere in the Pacific, cannibalism was part of warfare. Leadership was based on a system of chieftainship, which was often but not always hereditary, although chiefs needed to demonstrate leadership abilities to avoid being superseded by more dynamic individuals. The most important units of pre-European Maori society were the whānau or extended family, and the hapu group of whānau. After these came the Iwia tribe, consisting of groups of hapu. Related hapu would often trade goods and cooperate on major projects, but conflict between hapu was also relatively common. Traditional Maori society preserved history orally through narratives, songs, and chants. Skilled experts could recite the tribal genealogies back for hundreds of years. Arts included whaikauriro, song composition in multiple genres, dance forms including haka, as well as weaving, highly developed wood carving, and tamoko. New Zealand has no native land mammals, so birds, fish and sea mammals were important sources of protein. Maori cultivated food plants which they had brought with them from Polynesia, including sweet potatoes, taro, gourds, and yams. They also cultivated the cabbage tree, a plant endemic to New Zealand, and exploited wild foods such as fernroot, which provided a starchy paste. Early contact period. Explorers and other visitors. The first Europeans known to reach New Zealand were the crew of Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who arrived in his ships, Eemskerkenseeharen. Tasman anchored at the northern end of the South Island in Golden Bay in December 1642 and sailed northward to Tonga following an attack by local Maori. Tasman sketched sections of the two main islands' west coasts. Tasman called them Statenland, after the States General of the Netherlands, and that name appeared on his first maps of the country. In 1645, Dutch cartographers changed the name to Nova Zealandia in Latin, from Nieuw Zealand, after the Dutch province of Zealand. It was subsequently anglicised as New Zealand by British naval Captain James Cook of HM Endeavour, who visited the islands more than 100 years after Tasman during 1769 to 1770. Cook returned to New Zealand on both of his subsequent voyages. Various claims have been made that New Zealand was reached by other non-Polynesian voyages before Tasman, but these are not widely accepted. Peter Trickett, for example, argues in Beyond Capricorn that the Portuguese explorer Cristóvão Oda Mendonça reached New Zealand in the 1520s, and the Tamil bell discovered by missionary William Colenso has given rise to a number of theories, but historians generally believe the bell is not in itself proof of early Tamil contact with New Zealand. For the 1790s, the waters around New Zealand were visited by British, French and American whaling, sealing and trading ships. The crews traded European goods, including guns and metal tools, for Maori food, water, wood, flax and sex. Maori were reputed to be enthusiastic and canny traders, although there were some conflicts, such as the killing of French explorer Marc-Joseph Marion du Fresnay in 1792 and the destruction of the Boyd in 1809. Most contact between Maori and European was peaceful. From the early 19th century, missionaries began settling in New Zealand and attempting to convert Maori to Christianity and controlled the considerably lawless European visitors. Maori response. The effect of contact on Maori varied. In some inland areas life went on more or less unchanged, although a European metal tool such as a fishhook or hand axe might be acquired through trade with other tribes. At the other end of the scale, tribes that frequently encountered Europeans, such as Ngāpuhi in Northland, underwent major changes. Pre-European Maori had no distance weapons except for tau, and the introduction of the musket had an enormous impact on Maori warfare. Tribes with muskets would attack tribes without them, killing or enslaving many. As a result, guns became very valuable and Maori would trade huge quantities of goods for a single musket. From 1805 to 1843 the musket wars raged until a new balance of power was achieved after most tribes had acquired muskets. In 1835, the peaceful Moriori of the Chatham Islands were attacked, enslaved, and nearly exterminated by mainland Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Tama Maori. In the 1901 census, only 35 Moriori were recorded, although the numbers subsequently increased. Around this time, many Maori converted to Christianity. The reasons for this have been hotly debated, and may include social and cultural disruption caused by the musket wars and European contact. Other factors may have been the appeal of a religion that promotes peace and forgiveness, a desire to emulate the Europeans and to gain a similar abundance of material goods, and the Maoris' polytheistic culture that easily accepted the new god. European settlement increased through the early decades of the 19th century, with numerous trading stations established, especially in the north. The first full-blooded European infant in the territory, Thomas King, was born in 1815 at Hoey in the Bay of Islands. Kerry, founded in 1822, and Bluff, founded in 1823. Both claim to be the oldest European settlements in New Zealand after the CMS mission station at Hoey, which was established in December 1814. Many Europeans bought land from Maori, but misunderstanding and different concepts of land ownership led to conflict and bitterness. In 1839, the New Zealand Company announced plans to buy large tracts of land and establish colonies in New Zealand. This alarmed the missionaries, who called for British control of European settlers in New Zealand. British sovereignty. In 1788 the colony of New South Wales had been founded. According to the future governor, Captain Arthur Phillips' amended commission, dated the 25th of April 1787, the colony of New South Wales included all the islands adjacent in the Pacific Ocean within the latitudes of 10 degrees 37' and 43 degrees 39', which included most of New Zealand except for the southern half of the South Island. In 1825, with Van Diemen's Land becoming a separate colony, the southern boundary of New South Wales was altered to the islands adjacent in the Pacific Ocean with a southern boundary of 39 degrees 12', which included only the northern half of the North Island. However, these boundaries had no real impact as the New South Wales administration had little interest in New Zealand. In response to complaints from missionaries about lawless sailors and adventurers in New Zealand, the British government appointed James Busby as official resident in 1832. In 1834 he encouraged Maori chiefs to assert their sovereignty with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1835. This was acknowledged by King William IV. Busby was provided with neither legal authority nor military support and was thus ineffective in controlling the European population. Treaty of Waitangi in 1839, the New Zealand Company announced its plans to establish colonies in New Zealand. This and the increased commercial interests of merchants in Sydney and London spurred the British to take stronger action. Captain William Hobson was sent to New Zealand to persuade Maori to cede their sovereignty to the British Crown, in reaction to the New Zealand Company's moves. On 15 June 1839, a new letters patent was issued to expand the territory of New South Wales to include all of New Zealand. Governor of New South Wales George Gibbs was appointed governor over New Zealand. This was the first clear expression of British intent to annex New Zealand. On 6 February 1840, Hobson and about 40 Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands. Copies of the treaty were subsequently taken around the country to be signed by other chiefs. A significant number refused to sign or were not asked, but, in total, more than 500 Maori eventually signed. The treaty gave Maori sovereignty over the lands and possessions and all of the rights of British citizens. What it gave the British in return depends on the language version of the treaty that is referred to. The English version can be said to give the British Crown sovereignty over New Zealand, but in the Maori version the Crown receives Kawanatanga, which arguably is a lesser power. Dispute over the true meaning and the intent of either party remains an issue. Britain was motivated by the desire to forestall other European powers, to facilitate settlement by British subjects and, possibly, to end the lawlessness of European whalers, sealers and traders. Officials and missionaries had their own positions and reputations to protect. Maori chiefs were motivated by a desire for protection from foreign powers, the establishment of governorship over European settlers and traders in New Zealand, and to allow for wider settlement that would increase trade and prosperity for Maori. Hobson died in September 1842. Robert Fitzroy, the new governor, took some legal steps to recognize Maori custom. However, his successor, George Grey, promoted rapid cultural assimilation and reduction of the land ownership, influence and rights of the Maori. The practical effect of the treaty was, in the beginning, only gradually felt, especially in predominantly Maori regions.